As the sun set on the 31st of May, it was setting on the greatest clash of battleships the world would ever see. The Germans had known they needed to break the blockade inflicted upon them by the British at Scapa Flow and impose their own. This let the German Admiralty persuade the Kaiser to allow them to risk some of his precious ships. Their plan was to break off a piece of the British fleet and then destroy it. To begin with, it looked like this gamble was going to pay off. Hipper's force appeared unstoppable. Beatty's battlecruisers were blowing up around him. Everything was going the German way. Then the Germans smashed into the immovable object that was Admiral Jellicoe's Grand Fleet. 13 torpedo boats were sent out to attack to cover the German escape. 4 were badly hit. 1 was sunk, but Jellicoe turned away. Had he not turned away, he may have been able to destroy the German fleet, but he could have also destroyed his own. The 2 battle fleets disengaged, but the battle itself was far from over. Only 10 minutes later, Beatty sighted the German battlecruisers. All 6 British ships opened fire, hitting the 4 Germans. Seydlitz was hit hardest. 2 13.5-inch shells from Princess Royal slammed into her. 1 hit the bridge, killing all the men there and drenching her charts in blood. The light cruiser HMS Castor spotted smoke and set off to investigate, along with the 4th light cruiser squadron. They could make out shadowy shapes slipping through the water. This was the German 5th torpedo boat flotilla, who flashed the British recognition signals. Then they waited. They waited until the British light cruiser got within 1,000 metres before opening fire and forcing the light cruiser back. HMS Castor's squadron then went to the aid of HMS Marne. She was in a gunfight with SMS Hamburg, part of Commodore Reuter's 4th scouting group. HMS Calliope had been hit 5 times by 6-inch shells, putting 2 of her own guns out of action. A 3rd pierced her upper deck and detonated in the aft dressing station. Castor fired a torpedo and then opened up with her 6-inch guns. Hamburg was hit at least 3 times, killing 11 of her crew and putting the transmitter room out of action. It also put her port engine out of action. But rescue came from an unusual place. A group of obsolete pre-dreadnoughts under Rear Admiral Mauve distracted the British long enough for the Germans to disappear into the gloom. Jellicoe steamed southwards into the darkness, assuming the gunfire astern of him were the German light forces in action with his own. But during all of these encounters, critical information was not passed back to the Commander-in-Chief. 134 British warships lay between the 93 German vessels and home. One thing that Jellicoe was certain of was that the German fleet would have to go through his own if they were to get back to Horn's Reef. Jellicoe had no intention of fighting a night action. There was too much risk that he could lose it. The British did not train for night fighting, unlike the Germans, but he couldn't imagine that Scheer would be that brazen. The Germans had run into the Grand Fleet twice that afternoon, and they'd come off worse both times. The sun began to set at 8 o'clock. By 9 o'clock it was night, and the Grand Fleet closed up for night steaming. Having deployed his fleet for the night, Jellicoe retired to a small bed that he had set up in a shelter just behind the bridge. He lay down fully clothed and grabbed a few hours' sleep while his officers ate corned beef sandwiches and passes kai, the thick cocoa made from slabs of rich chocolate that was almost as important to the Royal Navy as rum. The Germans had felt the Royal Navy's destructive potential twice that afternoon, and they knew that a 3rd encounter during daylight hours would be disastrous. Scheer's flagship, Frederick de Grosser, had been badly damaged, and damage reports were coming in from all over the fleet. Seydlitz had suffered 24 large caliber hits, and Lutzow around 40. Scheer, too, redeployed his fleet. He took the older and more disposable ships and placed them at the head of the line. The German battlecruisers were sent to the back of the line. They were still under the command of Captain Johannes Hart of De Flinger, as Hipper was still trying to find a ship in a condition to command his flotilla from. De Flinger could only manage 18 knots as she had taken on 3,400 tons of water. Her crew were in a desperate struggle to stop more water coming in, while at the same time having to fight the fires that continued to smoulder. While the sailors were working hard to try and repair the damaged ships, the ship's surgeons fought to repair the damaged sailors. Many sailors were suffering from pyrrhic acid burns. Others had been blinded by scalding steam. Nauseating smells penetrated the close, stuffy decks with sweetish reek of blood and strangling stink of cordite, burned paint, linoleum and electrical insulation mixed with the stink of charred corpses. Similar was happening on the British fleet. One surgeon worked for 11 hours straight in the stoker's bathroom, which was only 12 feet square. On HMS Princess Royal, the electric lights had failed, forcing her surgeons to operate by flickering oil lamps. HMS Warrior had 100 dead men on board, and many more wounded when she was found by HMS Engadine. Little Engadine took the crippled Warrior in tow at 9 p.m. During the night, the weather worsened and her stern began to sink into the water. It became obvious that she wouldn't make port. Engadine came alongside her to take off what remained of her crew. The ships ground against each other, and there was the noise of rending steel as the larger ship tore chunks out of Engadine's hull. But they managed to get all of the crew off, including the wounded. The captain of the Warrior stood with his men and gave 3 cheers as their ship went down below the waves. Warrior would not be the only one to sink that night. Although Scheer had hoped to save as many of his ships as he could, at 9:10 p.m. he sent out a signal from Frederick de Grosser ordering them to turn southeast. His orders were that they should maintain course, no matter what. Lookouts on British destroyers were keeping a sharp eye out in case the enemy ships came off to their west. They did not expect the Germans to slip between them and the dreadnoughts to their east. At 10:15 p.m. a signalman from HMS Southampton whispered, "5 ships abeam." Commodore Goodenough looked over and picked out their faint silhouettes. They didn't know it yet, but this was Commodore Reuter's 4th scouting group, consisting of Stettin, München, Hamburg, Frauenloh and Stuttgart. The Germans could barely recognise them either. For a few moments, the 4 British light cruisers and the 5 German light cruisers steamed parallel to each other 800 yards apart. Then the Germans switched on their coloured recognition lights. Goodenough said, "I can't help who it is. Fire!" The captain of HMS Dublin, just behind him, did the same, and then both ships were pinned in the fierce dazzle of German searchlights. The German light cruisers concentrated on Southampton and smothered Goodenough's flagship in shell bursts. It was a point-blank engagement. Lieutenant Stephen King Hall ran to the boat deck to put out a fire and tripped over a heap of bodies. 3/4 of the upper deck men on Southampton had been killed or wounded. She burned so bright that men on the 5th Battle Squadron's ships could read signals on the bridge by her light. The 2 rear ships in Goodenough's squadron, Nottingham and Birmingham, kept their searchlights off, using the lights of the German ships to aim at. One of Dublin's shells burst on the side of an enemy ship, and for a moment one of Southampton's officers had a nightmare glimpse of her interior. A 6-inch shell struck the German cruiser München's aft cutter and detonated inside it, turning the boat into shrapnel and peppering the superstructure and aft searchlight platform. Stettin had a gun put out of action and a steam pipe fractured, which scalded and blinded the torpedo team. SMS Elbing took a direct hit to her wireless room. Lieutenant Bassinge had just come off watch and he was trying to get some rest. He woke up with flames all around him, burning his face and hands. He tried to crawl away, but he couldn't with his burned hands, so he had to crawl on his knees and elbows instead. Southampton was hit by 20 4.1-inch and 5.9-inch shells. 3 guns and 2 searchlights were knocked out. Worst of all, the ship's radio was damaged, meaning that Goodenough could not send messages to Admiral Jellicoe that they had encountered the German fleet. Southampton fired a 21-inch torpedo at them. It leapt across the sea between the 2 flotillas at 41 knots. The torpedo struck Frauenloh and ripped a giant hole in her hull. Port No. 4 gun still fired, but the engines ground to a halt. As they did, the lights went out. She had survived the Battle of Heligoland Bight, but she could not survive this. As the ship began to capsize, the crew gave 3 cheers to the Kaiser and the German Empire. She took 11 officers and 308 men down to the bottom of the sea with her. Things only got more chaotic as the night wore on. Around 11:30, HMS Champion swerved violently eastwards as shells started to fall around it. Nobody was quite certain where the shells came from. The captains of HMS Lydiard and HMS Landrail thought that they had come from the British themselves. 2 of Champion's destroyers were able to keep up with her, but the others were lost in the darkness. HMS Tipperary also discovered some ships that she thought were British. She got within 700 yards before flashing a recognition signal. The answer was a dazzling searchlight and a flurry of shells. In only 4 minutes, SMS Westphalia and SMS Nassau had fired 150 shells between them. Rostock, Elbing and Hamburg also got stuck in. They were so close that one young sub-lieutenant on Tipperary thought that the guns were firing down from above him. Her steam pipes were hit, bringing her to a halt. She disappeared behind a thick cloud of steam and smoke. Then oil leaking from her fuel tanks set the sea on fire. The German destroyer S-53 sailed into the inferno to try and rescue her crew. She managed to rescue 9 British sailors, but that was all that they could get them. They wouldn't be until 2 o'clock in the morning that Tipperary was abandoned and sank. In the confusion, HMS Brooke rammed HMS Sparrowhawk. The force of the impact catapulted 23 men from the Sparrowhawk directly onto Brooke's forecastle. Both skippers were convinced their ships were going to sink and ordered their men to scamper across to the other. The destroyer HMS Spitfire had been just astern of Tipperary and now found herself confronting the Nassau, which turned at full speed to ram. Spitfire's helmsman threw the wheel over as he tried to avoid collision, but it wasn't enough. The smaller ship almost rolled over by the force of the 20,000-ton dreadnought hitting her. The other boats in the flotilla broke away and fired torpedoes at the Nassau. The officers on the Nassau thought they'd been hit by one, until they found 2 meters of Spitfire's bow sticking into the side of the hull. They tried to use their guns to blow the little destroyer off them, but only to find they could not push them low enough. When they fired, the shells passed straight through the bridge and middle funnel, but they didn't detonate because they were too close. The pressure wave swept away the bridge foremast, funnels, boats and searchlight platform. It killed almost everybody on the bridge, except for 2 sailors and the captain, who got away with just having his cap blown off. Things weren't much better down below. Broken circuit had electrified the entire ship. A 19-year-old surgeon probationer was trying to help the wounded, but every time he touched anything, he got an electric shock. The surgeon probationers were medical students who had not yet finished their course of study. These young docs were not expected to undertake surgery, but the one on HMS Spitfire, Dr. Bell, would not only have to amputate a limb single-handed, he would have to do it in the dark. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for this. Once they eventually got clear of the Nassau, she had lost 60 feet from the side of her hull, swapping it with 20 feet of armour plating from the battleship. Even more remarkably, she was still able to move and reach the Tyne under her own power. After Nassau disappeared into the darkness, another ship tore past her, so close that the crew could feel the heat from the fire that was pouring out of her. This was the armoured cruiser HMS Black Prince. Black Prince had got lost in the night and steamed south through the gloom, hoping to find the British fleet. Near midnight, she had found a group of dreadnoughts, but they weren't British. She had stumbled into the very centre of Scheer's battle line. The Germans lit her up with their searchlights and then started firing at her at a range that they could not miss. They were so close that they could see the crew rushing about on the burning deck as they blew 2 of her funnels clean off. She ran away into the night, trailing flames behind her. When the fires reached her magazine, the detonation was primeval. There was a sound like a gigantic thunderclap, and debris was thrown whirling into the air. Everything burned. Powder, air, even metal. The entire ship's hull was incandescent. Flames sprayed from the iron mass. Then the sea was suddenly empty again. No fire, no smoke. Just gurgling waves. She had just disappeared, taking her entire crew of 857 officers and men with her. The fire wasn't just going one way. HMS Fortune managed to cause havoc on Oldenburg's bridge. One of her 4-inch shells badly wounded the captain, who had taken the wheel when his helmsman was killed, along with the rest of the bridge crew. But there was no way that they could get away. The column of German warships on either side, only a few hundred yards away from them. Only one man was left when the foregun was destroyed. He got away with no other injury than a black eye from where he'd hit the gun sight. But a man coming up from the engine room had his arm blown off, and the rest of the crew dragged him onto a raft that they'd lashed together as the ship began to sink. The destroyer Ardent had been following Black Prince. She wasn't quite sure whether these were British or German ships and had flashed a recognition signal. By the time the Germans had finished with her, she, like Black Prince, was a fiery wreck. Only 2 men from Ardent survived. The 4th destroyer flotilla had been effectively annihilated. 4 of the ships were sunk or sinking, and 3 others were heavily damaged. The rest were scattered. Despite all of the pyrotechnics going on behind them, nobody had thought of waking up Admiral Jellicoe to let him know what was going on. Captain Sterling on the destroyer Falconer tried to send a wireless message, and he repeated his message 3 times, but never got through as the Germans were flooding the airways with their powerful telefunken sets. However, Sterling was not happy with just letting the Admiral know. He was going to go in for the attack himself. He had 3 other destroyers with him: Obedient, Marvel and Onslaught. At 2 minutes past 2 in the morning, they launched torpedoes. One torpedo crossed ahead of Grosser Kursforce. Another passed within 100 yards astern of Kronprinz. Hessen also had to avoid one, and Markgraf turned to avoid 2 more. Then there was the blinding flash of light and a long, drawn-out boom roaring through the night. A torpedo had hit the old pre-dreadnought Pommern. A dull red ball of fire appeared on her deck. It raced fore and aft until it reached the mainmast. It flared up the mast in big red tongues of flame, uniting between the mastheads in a big black cloud of smoke and sparks. The ends of the ship came up as her back was broken, and huge pieces of debris started falling near Deutschland. All 845 of her crew went down with her. Onslaught was also hit as she was turning away. A shell hit her bridge and ignited a box of cordite in the chart house. The flash fire killed the commander and several of her crew. Onslaught was the last British ship to be hit that day. At 1:30, the first elements of Scheer's fleet had reached Horn's Reef. They passed safely above 3 British submarines lying on the bottom, as they had been ordered to remain submerged until the 2nd of June. When the Grand Fleet reformed that morning, Marlborough was missing. She could not keep up with the rest of the fleet due to the flooding from a 70-foot hole in her side, but she was not the only one in a poor condition. Lutzow limped away from the battlefield, escorted by 6 destroyers. She sank at 2:45 a.m. Seydlitz avoided Lutzow's fate only by the narrowest of margins. She lost the main fleet on her way to Horn's Reef and had to try and get there with a wrecked gyro compass and her charts covered in blood. HMS Agincourt, with 14 12-inch guns, saw her, but did not challenge her as she passed through a gap in the British line. She was spotted again by HMS Malaya with 8 15-inch guns. She passed within 4,000 yards of HMS Marlborough without a shot being fired. HMS Revenge did order an attack with her secondary armour of 6-inch guns, but by the time that the gun crews got to work, she had already slipped away into the darkness. At 3 in the morning, poor Wiesbaden finally gave up its fight and sank with its colours still flying. A mere 11 men remained. They lashed the raft together from some beams. It kept capsizing, turning over and over. Each time, 1 or 2 of the survivors were lost, until only Chief Stoker Hugo Zen remained. He drifted on the raft for 36 hours before being picked up by a Norwegian steamer. As Wiesbaden finally slipped below the waves, Ebeling too was being abandoned. HMS Sparrowhawk, helpless after her collision with HMS Brooke, had her drifted close enough to see her as she stood on her head and sank. 3 hours later, she spotted a raft with 23 survivors from HMS Tipperary. The survivors of HMS Fortune were also still clinging to their raft. With them was a fox terrier who belonged to one of Fortune's officers. Little Betsy had been adopted by the crew as the ship's pet. She clung to them with her paws, whimpering from the cold, until she could hold on no longer. She fell off the raft. The men tried to get her back, but they couldn't get hold of her. The cold took her, and she went down to rejoin her master at the bottom of the sea. The Battle of Jutland was over. Next time I'm going to talk a little about the consequences of this battle. If you'd like to hear about that, then please like and subscribe so that the algorithm may show it to you. If not, then thank you for listening this long.